You ever sit at a desk late at night? The kind of late where the world outside goes quiet, but your head gets louder, and wonder why it feels like you've been doing everything right, but somehow still falling behind. Not failing outright, no, that would at least be clear, something you could point at and say, there, that's the problem. This is different. This is the slow kind of losing. The kind where you show up, you put in the hours, you stack your books, you underline half the page like the answer might glow brighter if you mark it enough. And still, when it matters, you come up short. And the worst part? Nobody pulls you aside and says, hey, you're going in the wrong direction. They just let you keep going, like a man running on a treadmill, sweating, breathing hard, thinking he's getting somewhere. See, people love to talk about effort. Work harder, stay up later, sacrifice more. It sounds noble. It sounds like something you can control. But let me ask you something, and I want you to be honest about it. Have you ever noticed how there's always that one person, maybe in your class, maybe at work, maybe someone you quietly compare yourself to, who doesn't seem to be grinding the same way? And yet, when the results show up, they're already there, waiting like they knew the ending before the story even began. That's the part that messes with your head. Because if effort was the whole story, you'd be ahead. You've done the long nights. You've had the cheap coffee, the kind that tastes like regret, but keeps your eyes open just enough to keep going. You've told yourself, just one more chapter, more times than you can count. And still, something doesn't click. So you start turning it inward. Maybe I'm not smart enough. Maybe I'm too slow. Maybe I just don't have it. And that thought, it's dangerous. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. It sits in the background while you're studying, while you're working, while you're pretending to focus, but really just fighting off the weight of it. And here's what nobody tells you. Most of the time, it's not true, not even close. But when you don't have an explanation, your brain fills in the gap with whatever hurts the most, because at least that feels like an answer. Now think about how you were taught to study. Go back for a second. Nobody really sat you down and explained how learning works, did they? It was always something vague. Read the chapter, take notes, pay attention in class, review before the test. That's it. No one explained what your brain actually does with information, how it decides what to keep and what to throw away, why you can read the same paragraph 5 times and still forget it the moment you close the book. You were given instructions, not understanding, and so you followed them. Because that's what you do when you don't know any better. You trust the system. But the system, it's built for average outcomes. It's built to move people along, not to make them sharp, not to make them efficient, not to make them dangerous in the way that they can walk into a room and know exactly what they're doing. And that's where the gap begins. Quietly, slowly. You don't notice it at first. You just feel like you're working harder than you should for results that don't match the effort. And maybe you brush it off. Maybe you say, that's just how it is. But then it keeps happening. Test after test. Deadline after deadline. You prepare, you show up, and somehow it feels like you're always reacting instead of controlling the situation. Like you're chasing something that keeps moving just out of reach. And meanwhile, life doesn't pause for you to figure it out. Bills don't wait. Responsibilities don't slow down. You've got things pulling at your attention from every direction. Messages, notifications, people asking for your time, your energy getting chipped away piece by piece before you even sit down to focus. And then when you finally do sit down, you expect your brain to just switch on, like a machine that's been waiting all day. But it doesn't work like that. It's already tired, already scattered. And instead of adjusting the system, most people just push harder. They sit longer. They reread more. They highlight more aggressively, like pressing harder on the gas when the car's stuck in mud. And when it doesn't work, they don't question the method. They question themselves. That's the trap. That's the quiet, everyday trap that people fall into without even realizing it. And it's everywhere. Not just in school. You see it in offices, in people who spend all day busy but somehow never move forward. You see it in workers who stay late, take on more, say yes to everything, thinking that's the path up. But year after year, they're in the same spot, just more tired, more worn down. Effort without direction doesn't just waste time, it drains you. It makes you feel like progress is something other people have access to, like there's a door you missed somewhere along the way. And maybe the hardest part is that it looks normal. Everyone around you is doing the same thing. Sitting, reading, trying, struggling. So you don't question it. You think, This is just how it's supposed to feel. But let me tell you something straight, the kind of thing people don't say out loud often enough. If something keeps taking from you and giving almost nothing back, it's not discipline you need more of. It's clarity. Because discipline without clarity is just controlled frustration. You're doing the work, but you're not getting the return. And over time, that builds a kind of quiet resentment. Not just toward the process, but toward yourself. You start dreading the very thing you know you need to do. You open a book and already feel tired. You sit down to study and your mind drifts, not because you're lazy, but because somewhere deep down, it doesn't trust that this effort is going to pay off. And your brain, it's smarter than you think. It learns patterns. It notices when effort leads to results and when it doesn't. And if it keeps seeing you put in hours with no real outcome, it starts resisting. That's why it feels so hard to focus sometimes. Not because you can't, but because a part of you is saying, we've done this before, and it didn't work. So now you're not just fighting the material, you're fighting your own experience. And that's a heavy place to be, because it feels personal. It feels like something's wrong with you. But what if it's not? What if the problem isn't that you haven't been working hard enough, but that you've been aiming that effort in the wrong direction from the very beginning? What if all those hours, all that energy, all that frustration wasn't wasted because you lacked ability, but because nobody ever handed you a system that actually works with your brain instead of against it? That's a different kind of question. And it hits different, because now the issue isn't who you are, it's what you've been taught. And that changes everything. Daniel wasn't the kind of guy people noticed in a room, not because there was anything wrong with him, but because nothing about him tried to demand attention. He moved the way most people do when life has already started asking for things before they've figured themselves out. Quiet, a little tired around the edges, always carrying something unseen on his shoulders. The kind of weight that doesn't show up in conversations but sits there anyway while you nod and say you're fine. He worked evenings at a grocery store on the edge of town, the kind of place where the lights are always too bright and the air smells faintly of cardboard and overripe fruit. And by the time his shift ended, his legs would feel like they'd been borrowed and returned without care. But he'd still head home, keys jangling in his pocket, mind already trying to prepare for the next thing waiting for him. Because there was always a next thing, always another demand stacked on top of the last one. Like bills that don't ask if you're ready, they just show up. He'd get home, drop his bag by the door, sometimes stand there for a second longer than necessary, like his body was negotiating with itself about whether to keep going or call it a night. But he didn't have that kind of luxury, not really. So he'd push through, make himself a quick cup of coffee, even though he knew it wouldn't taste like anything good. Just something bitter enough to keep him awake. Then sit down at his desk, open his notes, and start doing what he believed studying was supposed to look like, because that's all he'd ever been shown. The pages would be filled with highlights, lines stacked on top of lines, colors layered like he was trying to trap the information there. Like if he marked it enough, it would finally stay. And he'd read, slow at first, then faster, then slower again when his mind drifted, eyes moving across the same sentences again and again, but nothing really landing, just passing through like water through a cracked glass. Every now and then, he'd check his phone without thinking, not because he wanted to, but because it had become a reflex, a small escape from the quiet pressure building in his chest. And each time he did, it cost him a little more focus, a little more energy. But he never counted those moments. Nobody ever taught him to count them. So he just kept going, telling himself, this is what effort looks like. This is what people mean when they say you have to put in the hours. The clock would move, but not in a way that felt earned, more like it was slipping past him. And before he knew it, it would be late enough that his body started shutting things down on its own, his eyes heavier, his thoughts slower. And still, he'd push for just a little more. Because stopping early felt like losing, even if continuing didn't feel like winning. And then came the exams. Always the same pattern, always the same quiet buildup of hope mixed with doubt. Walking into the room with notes still fresh in his mind, in that fragile way where you think you know something until you're asked to prove it. Sitting down, looking at the first question, and feeling that familiar drop in his stomach when the answer didn't come as quickly as it should. Or worse, when it felt like he'd seen it before but couldn't reach it, like it was behind a door he didn't have the key to. He'd write something, then second guess it, erase, try again, watching time move faster than his confidence. And by the time he walked out, there was always that same hollow feeling. Not shock, not even anger, just a quiet understanding that it hadn't gone the way he needed it to, again. And what made it harder wasn't just his own experience, it was what he saw around him. Because there was this other guy in his class, Marcus, who didn't fit the pattern Daniel had been taught to respect. Marcus didn't stay late, didn't carry stacks of notes everywhere, didn't talk about how exhausted he was. In fact, most of the time he looked like he had space in his day, like he wasn't being chased by the same clock everyone else was running from. And that alone was enough to make people underestimate him, to assume he wasn't trying as hard. But then results came back, and there he was, near the top, consistently, without the visible struggle everyone else wore like a badge. Daniel noticed it the way you notice something that doesn't make sense. Not immediately, but over time, small details adding up. Like how Marcus would close his notebook more often than he kept it open. How he'd sit quietly for a minute or two, doing nothing that looked like studying. How he'd leave earlier than everyone else, without that anxious look of someone who thinks they haven't done enough. It didn't add up. Not with everything Daniel believed about effort and results. And that gap started to bother him. Not in a loud way, but in the kind of quiet curiosity that sticks with you, even when you're trying to ignore it. One night, after another long shift and another session that felt like motion without progress, Daniel caught himself staring at his notes, not reading, just staring. And the thought slipped in almost by accident. What if I'm doing this wrong? And it wasn't a dramatic moment, no music, no sudden realization, just a simple question that felt heavier the longer it stayed, because it challenged something he hadn't questioned before, the method itself. Up until then, he'd only questioned himself, his discipline, his intelligence, his ability to focus, but not the process, not the structure he'd been following without thinking. And once that question showed up, it didn't leave easily. It followed him the next day, into class, into the moments where he watched Marcus again. This time more carefully, not with comparison, but with attention, trying to see what was actually different instead of what he assumed was. He noticed that Marcus didn't start studying until he wrote something down first. A small list, clear, specific, not vague like study chapter 3, but focused like understand these 3 ideas. And that alone felt different, more intentional, like he was deciding what mattered before he began, instead of hoping everything would somehow stick. Daniel started to see other patterns too, like how Marcus would test himself without looking at the material, sitting there with his notebook closed, writing out what he remembered, even if it wasn't perfect, even if it was incomplete. And there was something uncomfortable about watching that, because it looked harder in a different way, not physically, but mentally, like he was choosing to struggle on purpose. And that didn't match the way Daniel had been studying, where the goal was to avoid struggle by rereading until things felt familiar, even if that familiarity was shallow, even if it disappeared the moment it was needed. And that contrast started to settle in, slowly, not as a full understanding yet, but as a growing sense that maybe the difference wasn't how much time they were putting in, but how that time was being used, and more importantly, how their brains were being engaged during that time. Daniel didn't change everything overnight. He wasn't that kind of person. But the next time he sat down to study, something small shifted. Before opening his notes, he paused, just for a moment, and asked himself what he was actually trying to get out of the session. Not in a general sense, but specifically, and it felt strange at first, like he was slowing down when he should be starting. But he wrote something down anyway, a short list, nothing complicated, just clearer than what he'd done before. And then he began, not by reading everything, but by focusing on those points. And when he caught himself drifting back into old habits, rereading without thinking, he stopped, closed the page, and tried to recall what he'd just seen. And that part was uncomfortable, because suddenly there was no hiding, no illusion of understanding. Either he knew it or he didn't. And more often than not, he didn't. Not as well as he thought. And that could have been discouraging. It almost was. But there was also something honest about it, something that felt more real than the false confidence he used to build from rereading. The session didn't feel easier. If anything, it felt more demanding. But when he finished, there was a different kind of tiredness. Not the scattered, drained feeling he usually had, but something more focused, like the energy had actually been used for something, instead of leaking out in every direction. And he couldn't say yet that it was working. Not fully, but for the first time in a while, It felt like he wasn't just going through the motions. He was actually engaging with the process, actually testing himself, instead of just exposing himself to information and hoping it would stick. And that small shift, barely noticeable from the outside, was the beginning of something he hadn't had before. Not more time, not more effort, but a different way of thinking about what he was doing, and why. The thing that really changed everything for Daniel didn't come from a big moment. It didn't arrive like some clear lesson handed to him in a neat sentence. It came in pieces, small observations that didn't seem important at first, but refused to leave once they settled in his mind. And the more he paid attention, the more he realized that what he had been calling studying all this time wasn't really learning at all. It was closer to exposure, like standing in the rain and expecting to understand water just because you're getting wet. See, Daniel had always believed that if he spent enough time around information, something in his brain would eventually absorb it, like osmosis, like proximity alone was enough. And that belief had shaped everything he did, the long hours, the endless rereading, the quiet hope that repetition without resistance would somehow turn into memory. But what he started noticing in Marcus, and later confirming through his own attempts, was something almost uncomfortable to accept. The brain doesn't reward exposure, it rewards retrieval. And that difference, small as it sounds, flips the entire game on its head. Because if learning isn't about putting information in, but about pulling it out, then most of what people do when they study is backwards, completely backwards. And that realization hit Daniel harder than he expected. Not because it was complicated, but because it made too much sense. The reason he forgot things during exams wasn't because he hadn't seen them enough. It was because he had never trained himself to recall them under pressure. He had trained himself to recognize them. And recognition is easy. Recognition is comfortable. It gives you that false feeling of, yeah, I've seen this before. But exams don't ask if something looks familiar. They ask if you can produce it when nothing is there to help you. And once Daniel saw that clearly, he couldn't unsee it. He started looking back at all those hours he'd spent rereading, and realized that most of them had been spent in a state of passive agreement, nodding along with the material instead of wrestling with it, letting his eyes do the work instead of forcing his brain to struggle. And suddenly, the frustration he'd been carrying for so long started to shift direction. It wasn't aimed at himself anymore. It was aimed at the method, at the system he'd been following without question, the one that made him feel productive while quietly keeping him stuck. But the twist didn't stop there, because as he kept experimenting, kept adjusting the way he approached each session, he started noticing something else, something even more practical. His energy mattered more than his time. And that was another belief he had to let go of, because like most people, Daniel had been measuring his effort in hours, how long he sat at the desk, how late he stayed up, how much he could push through fatigue, and he wore that like proof that he was doing enough. But when he paid closer attention, he realized that not all hours were equal, not even close. There were moments when his mind was sharp, when recalling information felt possible, when connections formed almost naturally. And then there were long stretches where he was technically studying, but nothing was sticking, where he'd read a page and immediately forget what it said, where his focus drifted every few minutes. And yet, he had been counting all of that as work, as if time alone guaranteed progress. Marcus, on the other hand, seemed to treat his energy like something limited, something to be protected, not wasted. And that showed up in small ways that Daniel hadn't considered important before, like how he didn't study right after draining activities, how he kept his sessions shorter but more intense, how he avoided distractions, not through willpower, but by removing them before they had a chance to pull him away. And at first, that looked like discipline. But the more Daniel thought about it, the more it looked like strategy, like understanding how the brain actually functions instead of forcing it to behave like a machine. And that idea, that you don't control focus by trying harder, but by designing conditions where focus becomes easier, was another shift that changed how Daniel approached everything, because it meant he didn't have to fight himself as much as he thought. He just had to stop putting himself in situations where distraction was the default. And that led him to something even more uncomfortable. His environment had been working against him the whole time. The same desk where he studied was the same place he scrolled through his phone, watched random videos, checked messages, and his brain had already linked that space with distraction, with switching tasks, with shallow attention. So every time he sat down to study, he wasn't starting from zero. He was starting from a pattern that had been built over months, maybe years, and no amount of motivation could override that instantly. Marcus had changed that pattern, not by thinking differently, but by acting differently, by creating a space that signaled one thing to his brain: focus, and nothing else. And Daniel realized how little attention he had paid to that before, how he had expected his brain to adapt without giving it any consistent signals to follow. And then there was the structure, or rather, the lack of it, because Daniel's study sessions had always been random, based on when he felt like it, when he had time, when he wasn't too tired, and that unpredictability meant his brain never knew when to switch into learning mode. It was always reacting, never preparing, while Marcus treated his study time like a fixed appointment, something that didn't depend on mood or convenience. And over time, that consistency had turned into something automatic. His brain began to anticipate the work before it even started, like showing up to a job you've been doing long enough that your body already knows what to do. And that's when the full picture started to come together for Daniel, not as separate tips or tricks, but as a system, a way of aligning how he studied with how his brain actually worked. And the biggest realization, the one that tied everything else together, was this: learning isn't about comfort, it's about controlled difficulty, about putting your brain in a position where it has to work just hard enough to struggle, but not so hard that it shuts down. And that balance is where real progress happens. Everything he had done before had been designed to avoid that struggle, to stay in the safe zone of recognition and repetition. But that safety had cost him retention. It had cost him confidence. And once he stepped out of it, once he started embracing that discomfort intentionally, the results began to shift, slowly at first, almost unnoticeable, but real, and more importantly, repeatable. And maybe the most surprising part of all this wasn't that the system worked. It was that it had always been there, hidden in plain sight, used by people who understood it, even if they didn't talk about it, while everyone else kept grinding in the dark, thinking effort alone would carry them through. And Daniel couldn't help but think about how many people were still stuck where he had been, putting in the time, blaming themselves, never realizing that the problem wasn't their ability, it was the direction of their effort. And once that direction changed, everything else started to follow. There's a kind of moment that doesn't look like much from the outside. No noise, no applause, nothing you could point at and say, that's where everything changed. But inside, it lands heavy, like something finally settling into place after being loose for too long. And for Daniel, that moment didn't happen during an exam, didn't come with a perfect score or some dramatic turnaround. It happened on a quiet night, sitting alone at his desk, the same desk that used to drain him, the same chair, the same dim light casting shadows across pages that once felt like a wall he couldn't climb. And yet something about the way he sat there now was different, not in posture, not in appearance, but in the way his mind moved, slower, more deliberate, less desperate. He had his notes in front of him, but they weren't open, not yet. And that alone would have felt strange a few weeks ago, almost wrong, like he was wasting time by not immediately diving in. But now, he paused, just long enough to ask himself what he was there to do. Not in a vague sense, not study for the exam, but something smaller, something he could actually hold in his mind. And when he wrote it down, it didn't feel like a chore. It felt like setting a direction, like choosing where to walk before taking the first step. And then he started, not by reading everything, not by drowning himself in information, but by engaging with it piece by piece. And when he reached the part where he would normally fall back into old habits, rereading, highlighting, letting his eyes do the work, he stopped himself, closed the page, and tried to recall what he had just seen. And that's where the silence showed up again. The same silence that used to make him uncomfortable, the kind that forces you to face what you actually know and what you don't. But this time, it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like part of the process. He struggled, of course he did. There were gaps, things he couldn't quite remember, ideas that slipped away the moment he reached for them. But instead of reacting with frustration, instead of taking it as proof that he wasn't good enough, he saw it for what it was: feedback, clear, honest, immediate. And there was something grounding about that, something that made the work feel real in a way it hadn't before. And as he kept going, something subtle started to happen. Not a sudden burst of confidence, not a dramatic shift, just a quiet sense of familiarity, like walking a path you've taken a few times before. Not perfectly memorized, but no longer foreign. And that feeling, small as it was, began to replace the constant tension he used to carry. the need to prove to himself that he was doing enough, because now he had something better than hope. He had evidence, small pieces of it, scattered across his sessions, moments where he could recall something without looking, moments where the answer came a little quicker, a little clearer. And it didn't stop there, because the changes he made weren't just about what he did during study sessions. They started to affect everything around them, the way he approached his time, the way he protected his energy. He stopped trying to squeeze studying into whatever space was left after everything else had drained him, stopped treating it like an afterthought, and instead gave it a place in his day where his mind was still capable of doing the work. And that shift alone made a difference he could feel, because he was no longer fighting against fatigue from the start. He was working with a version of himself that could actually respond. He cleaned his desk, not in some dramatic, life-changing way, just enough to remove the things that pulled his attention without asking. His phone out of reach, unnecessary clutter gone. And it was surprising how much easier it became to stay focused when there was less around him competing for it. Like the difference between trying to listen in a crowded room and sitting in a quiet corner where your thoughts don't have to fight to be heard. And still, none of this felt like a breakthrough in the way people usually imagine it. There were no perfect days, no sessions where everything clicked effortlessly. There were still moments of doubt, still times when his mind wandered, still nights where progress felt slow, almost invisible. But the difference was in how he responded to those moments. He didn't take them as signs to quit or as proof that the system wasn't working. He saw them as part of the process, as something to move through rather than something to avoid. And that mindset, quiet and steady, began to anchor him in a way that nothing else had before. And then came the day that would have broken the old version of him. An exam. Not the final one, not the most important, just another test in the long line of tests that used to define his confidence. And he walked into that room the same way he always did. Same walls, same desks, same low hum of nervous energy from everyone around him. But inside, there was less noise, less of that frantic questioning, less of the, "what if I forget everything?" that used to run through his mind like a loop he couldn't turn off. He sat down, looked at the first question, and for a brief second, the old feeling tried to creep in, that familiar drop in his stomach. But this time, it didn't take over, because something else was there too, something stronger, a memory of having done this before. Not the exact question, not the exact wording, but the act of recalling, the act of pulling information out without help. And when he started writing, it wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was enough to build on, enough to keep moving. And as he went through the test, he noticed something he hadn't felt in a long time. Control, not over everything, not over every answer, but over his own process, over the way he approached each question, the way he stayed present instead of drifting into panic. And when he walked out, there was no immediate celebration, no rush of excitement, just a quiet sense that something had shifted, something real, something he could trust. And that feeling stayed with him, not as a high, but as a steady presence, like a foundation he could stand on instead of constantly trying to find his balance. And later that night, sitting back at his desk, the same place where he had once questioned himself over and over again, he realized that the biggest change wasn't in his results, not yet. It was in his relationship with the work itself. It no longer felt like something he had to survive, something that drained him and left him doubting himself. It felt like something he could engage with, something he could improve at, something that responded to the way he approached it. And maybe that's the part people miss when they talk about systems and methods. They focus on the outcome, the grades, the performance, the visible results, but they overlook what happens underneath, the shift in how you see yourself, the quiet confidence that builds not from success alone, but from understanding, from knowing that what you're doing makes sense, that it aligns with how your mind actually works, and that even when things aren't perfect, you're moving in the right direction. And that understanding, once it settles in, changes more than just how you study. It changes how you approach challenges in general, how you deal with discomfort, how you respond when things don't come easily. Because you've seen firsthand that struggle isn't a sign of failure, it's a signal that you're doing something that matters, something that has the potential to stick. And that perspective, simple as it sounds, has a way of quieting the noise that used to hold you back. The doubts, the comparisons, the constant questioning of whether you're enough. Because now you're not relying on assumptions, you're relying on experience, on a process that has shown you, step by step, that progress is possible when effort is directed the right way. And as Daniel sat there, in that same quiet room, with the same life waiting outside the door, the same responsibilities, the same pressures, nothing about his circumstances had changed, but the way he moved through them had, and that made all the difference. At some point, after enough nights like that, enough quiet sessions where nothing looked dramatic but something kept stacking underneath, Daniel stopped asking the question that used to follow him everywhere, that low, constant, "Am I good enough for this?" and replaced it with something simpler, something more grounded. Did I do this the right way today? And that shift, small on the surface, changed how he measured everything, because for the first time, he wasn't chasing a feeling anymore. He wasn't waiting to feel confident before believing he was improving. He was looking at what he actually did, what he could recall, what he could explain without help, and that gave him something solid to stand on, something that didn't disappear the moment doubt showed up. And the truth is, nothing about his life suddenly became easy. His job didn't get lighter, the hours didn't stretch, the noise of the world didn't quiet down just because he had figured something out. The same responsibilities were still there, the same tired evenings, the same pull of distractions that always wait for you when your energy dips. But now, there was a difference in how he responded to all of it, because he had seen, in a very real, very personal way, that progress isn't about doing more. It's about doing what matters and letting the rest fall away. And that's a hard thing to accept when you've spent so long believing that more effort is always the answer. You see it everywhere, people adding more hours, more tasks, more pressure on themselves, thinking that if they just push a little harder, things will finally click. But most of the time, they're just stacking more weight on a system that isn't built to carry it. And eventually something gives. Sometimes it's their motivation, sometimes it's their confidence. Sometimes it's just the quiet decision to stop trying as hard because it doesn't feel worth it anymore. Daniel had been close to that point, closer than he liked to admit. Those nights where he sat at his desk and felt like he was doing everything he was supposed to do, but still going nowhere. That kind of feeling wears you down in a way that's hard to explain. It doesn't hit all at once. It builds, slowly, until one day you realize you're not just tired, you're disconnected from the reason you started in the first place. And that's why what he found mattered. Not because it made him perfect, not because it guaranteed success every time, but because it gave him a way to move forward without constantly fighting himself. It gave him a structure he could rely on when motivation wasn't there, when energy was low, when doubt tried to creep back in. And that's something most people underestimate. They think progress comes from big bursts of inspiration, from those moments where everything feels clear and possible. But those moments are rare. They don't show up on schedule. They don't carry you through the long stretches where the work still needs to be done. What carries you is something quieter, something less exciting, but far more dependable. A system that holds you in place when everything else feels uncertain. Something you can return to without overthinking, without negotiating with yourself every time you sit down. And the thing is, once you experience that, even in a small way, it's hard to go back. Because you start to see the difference between effort that moves you forward and effort that just keeps you busy. You start to notice how often people confuse the two, how often they wear exhaustion like proof that they're doing enough, when in reality, they're just repeating the same patterns that never gave them results in the first place. And maybe that's the part that stays with you. The realization that most of what you've been told about working hard is incomplete. Not wrong, but missing something essential. Because hard work without direction is just noise. It looks impressive from the outside. It fills time. It feels productive. But it doesn't guarantee anything. And over time, that gap between effort and outcome starts to show. In the results you don't get. In the confidence you don't build. In the quiet frustration that never quite leaves. So the real question isn't whether you're working hard enough. It's whether the way you're working is actually designed to get you where you want to go. And that's not something you can answer by looking at how tired you are at the end of the day. It's something you answer by looking at what you can do now that you couldn't do before, what you can recall, what you can explain, what you can handle without falling apart under pressure. And that kind of honesty, the kind that looks at results instead of intentions, it can be uncomfortable at first, because it forces you to let go of the story you've been telling yourself about effort. It forces you to admit that maybe the problem wasn't that you didn't try hard enough, but that you didn't know what trying right actually looked like. And that's not an easy thing to sit with, but it's also where things start to change. Because once you see it, once you understand that your brain responds to clarity, to retrieval, to consistency, to the way you structure your environment and your time, you realize that you have more control than you thought, not over everything, not over every outcome, but over the process that leads to those outcomes. And that's where real confidence comes from. Not from hoping things will work out, but from knowing that you're doing what needs to be done in a way that actually makes sense. And maybe that's what this all comes down to. Not some perfect routine, not some rigid set of rules you have to follow exactly, but a shift in how you see the work itself, from something you endure to something you understand, from something that drains you to something that builds you, slowly, quietly, in ways that don't always show up immediately, but add up over time. And if you're sitting there right now, feeling like you've been putting in the effort and not seeing the return, feeling like you're stuck in that loop where you try, you fail, you question yourself, and then you try again the same way. Maybe it's not you that needs to change as much as you think. Maybe it's the approach, the structure, the way you've been taught to engage with the work. And that's not a judgment, it's just a possibility, one that's worth considering before you decide that you're the problem. Because the truth is, most people never get told this. They just keep going, repeating what they've seen, hoping it will eventually work. And some of them get through it, some of them don't. But very few stop and ask whether the system itself makes sense, whether it's aligned with how they actually learn. And that question, simple as it sounds, can change everything if you let it. So maybe take a second, not a big decision, not some dramatic change overnight, just a pause. And ask yourself honestly, the next time you sit down to study, what exactly am I here to get out of this? How will I know if it worked? What will I do differently if it doesn't? Because those questions, quiet as they are, have a way of cutting through the noise, of bringing you back to what actually matters. And if this conversation feels a little closer to your own experience than you expected, if it sounds like something you've been going through but never quite put into words, then stick around. Not because there's some magic answer waiting, but because there's value in looking at these things honestly, in breaking down what works and what doesn't, without pretending it's easier than it is. And if you want more of that, more of these quiet, real conversations that don't rush past the hard parts, then you're always welcome to come back. Sit down for a bit and keep figuring it out together.